She chose concrete over her own kids. My brother told a packed courtroom I was an unfit mother who abandoned her children for a hard hat. But the man on crutches in the back row knew better. My name is Nora Whitfield. I'm 41 years old. I'm a forensic structural engineer for the State Transportation Authority. And on a cold November morning in Family Courtroom 4B, my older brother Graham stood up in a charcoal suit with his legal pads spread across half the petitioner's table like he was claiming territory, and told a judge I had abandoned my 2 children for what he called a hard hat hobby. Maya is 8, Leo is 10. They were at school that morning. Graham had filed the emergency custody petition exactly 14 days earlier on a Thursday morning, 48 hours after my father's funeral. The court was required to hear it inside 2 weeks. The clock had been ticking since the moment he laid those papers across our dead father's desk. I sat at the respondent's table with my hands in my lap. My right index and middle fingers don't fully open anymore. They curl inward permanently from the day I gripped a failing grade 5 steel scaffold bracket on the underside of an overpass long enough for 2 men to clear the platform. The tendons tore. The surgeon told me I'd never have a full grip again. He was right. That morning in 4B, my fingers ached. The damp November air does that to them. I rubbed my thumb across the curled knuckles under the table where no one could see, and I listened to my brother's attorney, a man named Arthur Sterling, who charged $650 an hour and wore cufflinks shaped like tiny gavels, explain to the court that I had chosen a career over my family. He didn't know what my career actually was. Graham didn't know either. He thought I poured concrete. He didn't know I was the only reason the I-95 overpass didn't collapse in April. He didn't know what I'd done on that scaffold 2 years before. He'd never asked. That gap between what the room believed and what was true is the reason I'm telling you this story. Let me back up. My father died on a Thursday in late October. He was 74. He'd been a draftsman for 46 years before he retired, the kind of man who kept his pencil sharpened to exact points and used a real T-square until the day his hands started shaking. He left me his heavy steel drafting compass. Inside the leather case, folded twice, was a note in his careful block handwriting. "You build what lasts." That was all it said. 4 words. I keep the compass on my desk now. I'll come back to it. The wake was held at our family's church, the same one my parents had attended for 38 years. Graham gave the eulogy. He was good at eulogies. He was good at every performance that required him to be the visible Whitfield, the one who stood at podiums and shook hands and made sure everyone in the room remembered who he was. He owned a regional insurance brokerage. He drove a black Cadillac. He parked it in 2 spaces. 2 days after the funeral, I drove back to my parents' house to collect a few of my father's things. I went into his study. That's where I found Graham. He was standing at the mantel with a cardboard box. My engineering awards had been on that mantel for 12 years. The State Transportation Commendation from 2014. The Forensic Certification from the Federal Highway Administration. The plaque from the I-90 inspection team. My father had put them there himself, one at a time, as I'd received them. He'd been proud of them in his quiet way. Graham was taking them down. He had already wrapped 2 of them in newspaper. In their place, he was setting up framed photographs of his own children at their christenings, their school portraits, their soccer team pictures. "Dad would have wanted family up here," he said without turning around. "Not work stuff." I didn't say anything. I watched him put the 3rd award into the box. Then he reached into his jacket and pulled out a folded set of papers, and he held them out to me across our dead father's desk. "You're going to want to read these," he said. "I'm doing what's best for the kids." It was an emergency custody petition, filed that morning. He was seeking temporary guardianship of Maya and Leo on the grounds that my work as a structural engineer, with its travel and overnight inspections and what he called dangerous job sites, made me an unfit primary parent. Attached was an affidavit from a neighbor I barely knew, a man named Ron Coyle from 2 doors down, claiming he had personally witnessed me leaving the children alone overnight on multiple occasions while I was off doing concrete work. I had never left my children alone overnight, not once. When I had overnight inspections, my mother stayed with them, and after she got sick, our neighbor Linda, a retired school teacher who Maya called Miss Linda, slept on the pullout. There were records. There were texts. There were grocery receipts. Ron Coyle's affidavit was fabricated. I knew at the moment I read it, because the date he claimed to have seen me leave was a date I had been at Maya's parent-teacher conference. I had the signed sheet in my email. I looked up at my brother. He was straightening his tie. "You don't have to make this ugly, Nora," he said. "Just sign the temporary transfer. The kids stay in the family. They go to a stable home. You keep your hard hat hobby. Everybody wins." I folded the papers in half and put them in my coat pocket. "It's a hard hat job, Nora," he said, like I'd argued. "It's not like you're saving the world out there in the dirt. You're pouring driveways." I walked out of the study. I drove home. I sat in my truck in my own driveway for 19 minutes before I went inside, because I didn't want Maya and Leo to see my face until I'd put it back together. That gap between what a room believes and what is true has a way of closing. It just rarely closes on anyone's preferred schedule. 2 days later, on the Sunday after the wake, Pastor Thomas stood up in front of the congregation and told them my family was going through a difficult season. He said my brother Graham was carrying a heavy burden. He said, and I want you to hear the exact words, "Sometimes the people we love choose concrete over their own kids, and we have to find a way to love them anyway." 3 people from that congregation texted me before the service was over. One of them sent a screen recording. I watched Pastor Thomas say it twice. He believed it. He'd repeated my brother's words without ever picking up the phone to ask me what was true. That was the primal wrong, not the petition. The petition was paperwork. The wrong was the way Graham had spent the 14 days between the wake and the hearing, telling everyone who would listen a version of me that didn't exist, and watching them nod and writing it down for the court. I want to tell you about the night that came up at the hearing, the one Sterling used, the night I missed Maya's first grade school play. It was 2 years ago on a Wednesday in April. I was on a routine inspection of a pedestrian overpass crossing the I-95 interchange in the next county. 2 construction workers were on a scaffold beneath the structure, doing routine bracket replacement. I was up top with my clipboard. I felt the vibration before I heard it. Heavy traffic was passing, and the deck was shifting in a way it shouldn't have been. I looked down through the access port and saw the grade 5 bracket on the south anchor starting to deform. The bracket was holding the entire weight of the scaffold and the 2 men on it. If it failed, the scaffold would drop 28 feet onto the highway median. I climbed down to the platform. I told them to clear. The bracket was tearing, and there was no time to wait for them to rig a secondary anchor. I gripped the bracket with both hands, braced my boots against the support beam, and I held it. I held it for 4 minutes and 18 seconds. I know because the foreman timed it on his radio. The first worker, David Ellis, made it to the platform. The second, a younger man named Marcus Vance, was halfway across when the bracket sheared. The scaffold dropped on the south side. I had slowed the failure enough that he didn't fall the full 28 feet. He fell 11 feet onto the deck and shattered both his legs. He was alive. He was going to be alive when the ambulance arrived. That was the only thing that mattered to me in that moment. My right hand was destroyed. The tendons in my index and middle fingers tore through. The surgeon who put me back together at Memorial that night told me I'd been holding 1,400 pounds of failing steel with my bare hands. He told me the only reason my hand was still attached to my wrist was that I'd let go at exactly the right second. Maya's school play started at 7 p.m. I was in surgery at 7 p.m. The play was about a magic garden. Maya had 3 lines. I didn't get out of the hospital until almost 11. I sat in the cab of my transit truck in the hospital parking lot with my right hand wrapped in a splint the size of a softball, and I cried for 14 minutes with the heater running full blast. Maya had saved me the program. Linda gave it to me when I got home. It was crumpled because Maya had held it in her fist all through the play, waiting to give it to me. I keep that program in my desk drawer. I have not thrown it away. Saving a bridge doesn't explain to an 8-year-old why her mother's seat was empty. Graham wasn't entirely wrong about the missed nights. He was wrong about the reason. That's the part the court was going to hear about. Sterling had subpoenaed my employment records. He had the dates. He had the missed events. He didn't have the bridges because the bridges weren't in the file. The bridges were classified as ongoing forensic matters, sealed under the Transportation Authority's Incident Review Protocol. He had half the story, and he was going to tell the room it was the whole story. The morning of the hearing, I parked in the courthouse lot at 8:14. I sat in my truck for 11 minutes before I went in. The cab still held the smell of cured concrete and diesel exhaust from the site visit the day before, and when I rolled down the window, a crack, the damp November air, carried the sharp bite of rust off the steel drainage grates in the lot. I flexed my right hand against the steering wheel until the ache settled into something I could carry. Then I picked up my bag and walked into Family Courtroom 4B. The room smelled like lemon polish and recycled air. The oak respondent's table was cold to the touch. Graham was already seated at the petitioner's table with Sterling, his legal pads fanned out across both their workspaces. Maya's pink jacket and Leo's school backpack were on a chair behind him. He had brought them. He had set them on his side of the courtroom like exhibits. Judge Eleanor Hayes took the bench at 9 a.m. exactly. She was a woman in her late 50s, gray hair cut short, reading glasses on a thin chain. She did not smile. Sterling stood up to make his opening. He talked for 22 minutes. He talked about my career, the dangers of bridge inspection, the long hours, the overnights. He talked about the Ron Coyle affidavit. He talked about Maya's missed play and 3 other events I'd missed in the last 4 years. He used the phrase "a pattern of abandonment" twice. He never said the words "forensic engineer." He said "construction worker." He said "site laborer." He said at one point, "a woman who has prioritized pouring driveways over raising her children." I rubbed my thumb across my curled fingers under the table. I did not look at Graham. When Sterling sat down, the judge turned to me. "Ms. Whitfield, do you wish to make an opening statement?" I stood up. My State Transportation Authority forensic badge was on its steel cable lanyard around my neck, the one Graham had once looked at and called a keychain. "I evaluate structural integrity," I said. "I'll respond to specific claims as they're raised." I sat back down. Judge Hayes wrote something on her pad. Sterling called his first witness, a man named Henry Dorr, the former site foreman from the I-90 inspection team. He'd retired the year before. Sterling walked him through a 30-minute testimony about how dangerous bridge work was, how unpredictable, how it required engineers to be on call at all hours and on site without warning. He used phrases like reckless site behavior and the kind of job site no responsible parent would commit to. Doer didn't say I'd ever done anything wrong. He just agreed with every adjective Sterling fed him. By the end of his testimony, the jury box where the public sat was nodding along. Doer stepped down. Sterling stood at the podium and adjusted his cufflinks. "Your Honor," he said, "are there any additional witnesses present who can speak to the respondent's pattern of reckless conduct on these work sites? Anyone in the gallery with first-hand knowledge?" It was a theatrical question. He didn't expect an answer. He was performing for the judge, suggesting that the courtroom itself was a community of witnesses. In the back row, a chair scraped against the tile. I heard it before I saw it. Then the sound I'd been hearing in my sleep for 2 years, even though I'd only heard it once before in person, in a hospital corridor in April of that same year. The heavy, rhythmic squeak of rubber-tipped crutches on courtroom tile. Squeak, step, squeak, step. I did not turn around. I kept my eyes on the table in front of me, on the grain of the oak, on the curl of my own right hand resting against my thigh. But I could see Graham. Graham turned. Graham looked at the back of the room, and something in his face shifted because he didn't recognize the man. But he recognized that the man was not part of his plan. If you think you know where this hearing is going, keep watching. You don't. The squeak of the crutches moved up the center aisle. I counted the rhythm. 10 steps, 15, 20. He was taking his time because his reconstructed knee did not let him do anything else. Your Honor, Sterling pushed back from his chair. We've concluded our witness list. I'm not sure who this gentleman... He stood up when you asked, Judge Hayes said. Let him approach the bench. The squeaking continued. Marcus Vance moved past the bar and stopped at the witness stand. He was 34 years old. He was wearing a button-down shirt that did not fit him quite right, the kind of shirt a man borrows from his brother-in-law when he needs to look respectable in court. His left leg was in a brace. His right hand gripped a thick manila envelope. He set the envelope on the rail of the witness box. He looked at me for the first time. I looked back. His eyes went to my hand. He didn't need to see my face. He didn't need to hear my name. He looked at the way my right index and middle fingers curled inward against my thigh, and his jaw tightened and his eyes went wet, and he gave me a single small nod. I gave one back. State your name for the record, the bailiff said. Marcus leaned forward and adjusted the microphone. The metallic clink of it rang out across the still courtroom. Marcus Vance. Mr. Vance, Judge Hayes said, how do you know the respondent? Marcus turned his head slowly toward Graham first, then toward the judge. He took a breath. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead. The HVAC kicked on with a low rattle. Somewhere in the gallery, a woman uncapped a water bottle. I'd know that grip anywhere, Your Honor, he said. Those fingers are the reason I'm breathing. The courtroom went still. Not quiet, still. There is a difference. Quiet is the absence of sound. Still is the absence of motion, of breath, of the small, constant shifts a room of people makes without realizing it. The clerk stopped typing. Sterling's hand froze halfway to his collar. Graham, who had been leaning back in his chair, sat forward an inch and did not move again. Your Honor, Marcus said, 2 years ago this April, I was working a scaffold inspection on the I-95 overpass north of Hartford. Grade 5 steel scaffold. My partner David Ellis was up top. I was on the middle platform. The forensic engineer who'd flagged the structure was checking the load-bearing joints when one of the support brackets gave. He paused. He shifted his weight off his bad knee. The whole scaffold should have gone. 2 stories down onto rebar. David was directly above the failure point. I was in the secondary fall path. He looked at the judge. He looked at me. He looked back at the judge. Ms. Whitfield grabbed the bracket with her bare hands. The steel had already torn open, the edge was sheared, and she grabbed it and she held it. She held it long enough for David to swing himself onto the secondary rigging and for me to clear the platform. I made it almost all the way. The bracket gave the rest of the way when I was 2 rungs from solid ground. I fell 11 feet onto rebar and shattered both my legs. He looked down at his left knee. David Ellis walked away with bruises. I walked away with a knee that took 14 months and 3 surgeries to rebuild. And Ms. Whitfield walked away with 2 fingers that don't open anymore because the steel cut through the tendons in her hand while she was holding the weight of 2 men and a scaffold platform. He reached for the envelope. 8 months later, my wife and I had our first daughter. We named her after my mother. And when it came time to choose a godmother, my wife told me there was only one person on earth she would consider, and it wasn't going to be negotiable. He unfastened the envelope's clasp. His hands were shaking, just slightly. He pulled out a stapled document 3 pages thick, with a notary seal embossed on the cover page and a 4x6 photograph paper-clipped to the front. "This is a sworn affidavit," he said. "Notarized last Tuesday. It includes a photograph from my daughter's christening, December of last year. Exhibit C. Ms. Whitfield is holding my daughter at the baptismal font. I'd like to submit it to the court." The bailiff stepped forward. Marcus handed him the document. The bailiff walked it the 8 feet to the bench. The squeak of his polished shoes on the tile was the only sound in the room. Judge Hayes took the affidavit. She set it flat on the bench. She slid the photograph out from under the paperclip and held it up to the fluorescent light. And for a long moment, she just looked at it. I knew the photo. I had a copy of it in my wallet. I was wearing a gray cardigan, and Marcus's daughter, Hannah, was 8 weeks old and wrapped in a white blanket, and my right hand was curled under her head, in the only position those fingers could still hold, and Marcus's wife, Diane, was standing next to me with her hand on my shoulder, and Diane was crying. Judge Hayes turned the photograph so the gallery could see it. She held it up for 10 full seconds. "For the record," she said, "the court is admitting Exhibit C, a notarized affidavit and photograph submitted by witness Marcus Vance. The photograph depicts the respondent, Nora Whitfield, serving as godmother at the witness's daughter's christening in December of last year." She set the photograph down. She looked at Sterling. Sterling did not look back. She looked at Graham. "Mr. Vance," she said, without taking her eyes off my brother, "do you have anything further to add?" Marcus turned his whole body toward the petitioner's table. He braced his weight on his crutches. He looked at Graham. Graham was looking at the legal pad in front of him, as though it might still have something useful written on it. "Yeah?" Marcus said. "I do." He waited until Graham looked up. She held a failing bracket with her bare hands while the steel tore her tendons, just so I could see my daughter be born. "You don't know the first thing about what kind of mother she is." Graham opened his mouth. He closed it. He opened it again. "Your Honor, this is... I was just looking out for their well-being." "Mr. Whitfield, you are not currently being questioned," Judge Hayes said. "Sit down." He sat. I stood up. I did not plan to stand. I stood because the moment required it, and because for 2 years I had been carrying a sentence in the back of my throat that I had never been allowed to say out loud, and because Graham was finally looking at me, and because Maya's pink jacket was still on the chair behind him. "Ms. Whitfield," the judge said, "do you wish to address the court?" "Briefly, Your Honor." I turned toward Graham. I did not raise my voice. I rested my curled right hand flat against the oak of the respondent's table. "I don't leave things that are breaking, Graham, not bridges, and definitely not my children." The room exhaled. I sat back down. Judge Hayes was already writing. She wrote for nearly a full minute. Sterling tried to stand, and she did not look up, and he sat back down. Graham was staring at the surface of the petitioner's table, at the legal pads, at the fanned-out exhibits that had seemed so impressive 40 minutes ago, and now looked like litter. She set down her pen. This court has reviewed the petitioner's evidence, including the sworn affidavit submitted by one Ronald Coyle, alleging that the respondent regularly left her minor children unsupervised for periods of 48 to 72 hours. This court has also reviewed sua sponte the public records associated with Mr. Coyle's residence and confirmed through the clerk's office that Mr. Coyle has not resided at the address listed on the affidavit since March of 2021. The affidavit is fraudulent on its face. Sterling's head dropped half an inch. The petition for emergency custody is dismissed with prejudice. The gavel came down. This court further finds that the petitioner, Graham Whitfield, knowingly submitted fabricated evidence to a family court of this state in an attempt to remove 2 minor children from a fit and demonstrably extraordinary parent. The court imposes sanctions against the petitioner in the amount of $34,200, payable to the respondent for legal costs, court costs, and punitive damages. The matter of counsel's role in the submission of the Coyle affidavit will be referred to the State Bar for review. The gavel came down again. Graham did not move. His hands were flat on the petitioner's table. His tie was still straight. His legal pads were still fanned out in the territorial spread he had arranged that morning. But his face had gone the color of the recycled air, and his mouth was slightly open, and he was looking at Maya's pink jacket on the chair behind him as though he had only just noticed it was there. "Your Honor," Sterling tried, "we would like to request—" "Counsel, you will receive a letter from the State Bar within 30 days. Until then, I would recommend you not speak." Sterling sat down. Marcus Vance was still standing at the witness stand. He had not moved. His crutches were braced under his arms, and the manila envelope was empty on the rail in front of him. Judge Hayes looked at him. "Mr. Vance, thank you. You are dismissed." He nodded. He turned. The squeak of the rubber crutch tips on the tile started again. Squeak, step, squeak, step. He moved past the bar, past the petitioner's table, past Graham, who did not look up. He paused at the respondent's table. He set his right hand briefly on the oak beside mine. He did not touch my hand. He did not need to. Then he kept walking. The squeak of the crutches moved down the aisle and out the doors of Family Courtroom 4B, and I sat very still at the respondent's table, and Graham sat very still at the petitioner's table, and the only thing between us was 8 feet of courtroom tile and the pink jacket of a child he had tried and failed to take. Judge Hayes was writing again. Graham finally turned his head. He looked at me for the first time all morning. His mouth moved. No sound came out. He tried once more. Nothing. I gathered my things slowly. There was no reason to rush. I folded the legal pad my attorney had slid in front of me at the start of the morning. I capped the pen. I picked up Maya's pink jacket from the chair behind the petitioner's table because Graham had pushed it there at the start and had not earned the right to hand it back to me himself. The jacket smelled like her shampoo. Strawberry, cheap, the kind she picked out at the drugstore because the bottle had a cartoon horse on it. I draped it over my arm. Leo's backpack was on the floor by Graham's chair. I picked that up too. Graham did not look at me. He was looking at the table. My attorney touched my elbow. "Nora, take a minute. Side room. Press is going to be in the hallway." "There's press?" "Family court fraud sanctions of $34,000. Get a paragraph in the local paper. Side room. 5 minutes." I went to the side room. I sat in a plastic chair. I put the jacket on my lap and the backpack on the floor between my boots. I rubbed my thumb over my curled fingers, slow, the way I had been doing for 2 years, and the ache that had been sharp all morning began to dull into the familiar throb that lived in my hand in November. I did not cry. I had not cried in court. and I was not going to cry in a side room with a water cooler and a poster about domestic violence resources. I sat there for 11 minutes. Then I picked up my children's things, and I walked out. The reporting reached me the way it always does, not all at once, in pieces through people who were in rooms I was not in. 3 days after the hearing, my cousin Carol called. She lived 2 streets over from Graham and went to the same congregation. She told me Sterling had filed a motion to withdraw as Graham's counsel. The state bar had opened a file. Sterling was not returning Graham's calls. A week after that, my mother's sister, who I had not spoken to in 9 months, called to say the church board had quietly removed Graham from the deacon rotation. They had not made a public statement. They had simply stopped putting his name on the schedule. 11 days after the hearing, the man whose name had been on the fabricated affidavit, Ronald Coyle, filed a civil complaint against Graham for using his name on a forged document. Carol told me Ronald was, in Carol's exact words, biblically furious. 14 days after the hearing, Graham's wife took the children to her sister's house in Albany. Carol did not know if it was a separation. She said the house looked dark from the street. I did not feel triumph at any of this. I did not feel anything that clean. I felt the way you feel when a piece of failing infrastructure finally comes down on a schedule you predicted. Not satisfied, just unsurprised, and aware that someone is going to have to clean up the debris. The check for $34,200 arrived in my mailbox on a Thursday. Graham did not include a note. I deposited it. I used a portion to pay my attorney. The rest I put in an account for Maya and Leo's college, the same account my father had started for them when Leo was born, the account Graham had not known existed because he had never asked. Pastor Thomas called on a Sunday evening. I was at the kitchen sink rinsing a pot. Maya was on the living room rug doing a worksheet about fractions. Leo was upstairs with a book. The house smelled like the chicken I had roasted that afternoon and the wood smoke from the neighbor's chimney across the street. I let it ring twice before I answered. "Nora, it's Tom Thomas, from the church." "I know who you are, Pastor." There was a long pause. I could hear him breathing. I could hear faintly the radiator ticking in his office, the same radiator that had ticked through every counseling session my mother had dragged us to as children. "I owe you an apology," he said. "A real one, not a card. I repeated things I should not have repeated. I said them from the pulpit. I said them to people who came to me asking what was going on with your family, and I gave them your brother's version, and I never once picked up the phone and called you." "No," I said. "You didn't. I should have asked you. You should have asked me what I was building." He was quiet. A long pause. "That's fair," he said. "That's more than fair. I'm not coming back to the church. I want to be clear about that. Not because of you specifically, because of the room. Because every person in that room heard him say I chose concrete over my children, and not one of them called to check on the children. I understand. I hope you do. Nora, if the kids ever, the door's open. That's all I wanted to say." "Sometime," I said. "Maybe, not now. Sometime is more than I deserve. It's what I have." I hung up. I stood at the sink for a moment with my hand on the phone. Then I went back to the pot. Maya looked up from her worksheet. "Mom, what's a common denominator?" "Bring it here. I'll show you." She brought the worksheet to the kitchen table, and I sat down beside her and showed her how to find one. And her small finger traced the numbers on the page, and her hair smelled like strawberry shampoo. And I did not think about Graham or the courtroom or the pastor for the next 40 minutes. That night, after Maya was asleep and Leo had finally put his book down, I went into my father's study. I had not changed it since he died. The drafting table was still angled toward the window. His chair was still pushed in. The lamp with the green glass shade was still on the corner of the table, the one he had used for 40 years, the one with the small chip in the base from when I had knocked it over at 12 and cried for an hour thinking I had broken something irreplaceable. He had glued it back together that same night and told me that most things that look broken are just waiting for someone patient enough to put them back. I sat down in his chair. The compass case was where I had left it, on the upper right corner of the drafting table, beside a coffee mug that still had his initials on the bottom in permanent marker from the office he had retired from in 2011. I opened the case. The compass was inside, heavy steel, the joint still tight after 60 years. The note was folded against the velvet lining. I did not need to unfold it. I knew what it said. You build what lasts. I took the compass out. I held it in my right hand, the way he had taught me, with the curled fingers cradling the shaft because they could no longer fully close around it. The metal was cold. It warmed slowly against my palm. On the drafting table was a set of preliminary schematics for a pedestrian bridge over the Sawkill River. The previous bridge had been condemned in September after a routine inspection found shear cracking in 2 of the 4 support pylons. The replacement was my project. The deadline for the load calculations was the end of the month. I clicked on the green lamp. I picked up a pencil. I set the compass to the first radius. The curled fingers ached against the cold steel, the way they always did in November, the way they would ache every November for the rest of my life. I began to work. I worked for an hour. I heard Maya turn over in her bed once through the wall. I heard the radiator click. I heard the wind move through the bare maple in the yard. I heard nothing from Graham, nothing from the church, nothing from anyone who had ever decided who I was without bothering to ask. At a little after 10, I got up and walked down the hall and opened Maya's door an inch. She was on her side, one arm flung out, the strawberry shampoo bottle visible on her dresser in the light from the hallway. Leo's door was closed. I could see the line of yellow under it where his reading lamp was still on. Against the rules, the way it had been against the rules every night for 2 years, and the way I had let it be against the rules every night for 2 years. I closed Maya's door. I went back to the study. I sat down at my father's table. I picked up the compass. I set it to the next radius. Some structures look delicate right up until you test their load-bearing weight. If you've ever had someone in your life decide what you were worth, without ever asking what you actually do, I want to know about it. Tell me in the comments. Tell me what they got wrong about you. Tell me what they never bothered to find out. I read them. I read all of them. And if this story stayed with you tonight, if you sat through it because some part of it sounded like something you've carried, do me a small favor before you go. Hit that subscribe button. Tap the bell so the next one finds you. Give this video a like if Marcus Vance walking up that aisle on his crutches meant something to you, because it meant something to me. And I think the algorithm should know that quiet people noticed. I've got more stories like this one. People who were dismissed, written off, replaced on mantles and erased from photo walls, and described in courtrooms by men who never once asked them a real question. Stay with me. I'll tell you the next one soon. Good night from the drafting table.